Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm going to talk to you today about New Zealand in the Vietnam War. Okay, from 1964 to 1972, a total of 3,500 New Zealanders served in the Vietnam War. 37 of them did not make it back. However, in 1962, even though they were part of the Australian Army training combat team, the ones that trained the Montagnards, the indigenous population of Vietnam, to how to train the Montagnards to handle the NVA and Viet Cong. 11 of those members were New Zealanders. They were part of the Australian Army team, but 11 of those people were New Zealanders. But from 1964 to 1972, 3,500 New Zealanders served in the Vietnam War. 37 of them lost their lives. And New Zealand had several roles in the Vietnam War. Their Navy, their Army, and their Air Force came to the Vietnam War. The SAS, the New Zealand SAS, their special forces, they came to the Vietnam War. And so did infantry regiments, as well as Air Force helicopters. However, the primary role that New Zealand had was artillery, and the 161st, or 161, the 161 Royal New Zealand Artillery Battery, part of the 16th Field Artillery Regiment. They came to the Vietnam War, and they supported the Australian Army in a lot of the Australian Army's ground missions, where the Australian Army went to search and destroy the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese. The 161 Royal New Zealand Artillery Battery, they provided artillery support to the Australians. The most notable one is the Battle of Long Tan. The artillery was very efficient at the Battle of Long Tan. And in the Battle of Long Tan, the New Zealand Army fired about 2 to 3 hours straight with almost never taking a break. And they fired 6 to 8 artillery rounds per minute. That's how efficient they were, and that's extremely efficient. And the artillery was vital to the Australians being able to win the Battle of Long Tan. The Australians did amazing things at the Battle of Long Tan. I'm not taking anything away from them, but New Zealand played a vital role in the Battle of Long Tan as well. And they were near the Australians in the Phuoc Tuy province, and that's where the New Zealanders were based as well. And the New Zealanders, even though, like with the Americans and the Australians, some were draftees, some were volunteers. Same with South Koreans. Some were draftees, some were volunteers. But for the New Zealanders, all of them were volunteers. Every single one of them. Okay? And I watched a really good video that talked about the people from the New Zealand Nursing Corps, Medical Corps, as well as from the New Zealand Air Force and the New Zealand Army. They interviewed a helicopter pilot, a nurse, and an infantryman, a rifleman. And the nurse's name was Daphne Shaw. And she was 27 when she got to Vietnam. And she arrived in Vietnam a day late because the plane that took her was a day late getting there to take her to her destination. And so when she got off the plane and onto the tarmac, nobody was there to pick her up. And finally somebody randomly came by on a Jeep and was gracious enough to take her to where she needed to be taken. And she was a nurse she was in the ICU, the post-surgical unit. So after people got done with their surgeries and had to get put in the intensive care unit, or ICU, Daphne Shaw took care of them. She mostly took care of New Zealand and Australian soldiers, but she also tended to South Vietnamese soldiers, but occasionally she would also tend to North Vietnamese or Viet Cong prisoner of war. And there were also some Vietnamese civilians that she tended to as well. One of them was a young Vietnamese boy they nicknamed Pooh Bear. And just like in war, accidents can happen sometime. And he accidentally got ran over by an Australian tank. And they had to amputate one of his legs. And they took good care of him in the hospital because when Pooh Bear's parents came to pick him up and take him home, he didn't want to leave. He wanted to stay with the New Zealand nurses and the New Zealand doctors and the New Zealand medics. But he didn't want to go back home to his parents, so they took that good of care of him, okay? And then Brian Sin is the helicopter pilot they interviewed. He piloted he piloted the Iroquois helicopter, and the Iroquois helicopter that he piloted, they transported a lot of Australian and New Zealand SAS troops. And they, a lot of times when they came to pick them up to extract them from their mission, they came down under heavy enemy fire. The rifleman Bruce Knight, he was an infantry rifleman, but he regarded a lot of the helicopter pilots as heroes because they came under a lot of enemy fire to extract the special forces, to pick up the special forces soldiers after they finished their mission. And also, if one of the special forces soldiers or one of the infantry soldiers got injured, they came under heavy fire to medically evacuate the injured or wounded soldier. But Bryanson rejects being called a hero. He said he was just doing his job. He said he loved the thrill of flying. He was a selfless warrior, I firmly believe, and I personally believe he was a hero, but Bryanson rejects being called a hero. All right. And Rifleman Bruce Knight, who was interviewed as well, he was fortunate that he said that he was in one of the few bases that did have hot water. They didn't have hot water when he arrived, but they had a creative engineer on base who was able to hook up electricity to the base, and he was able to get hot water for the soldiers. So they had hot water when they showered, but he also said most bases in Vietnam did not have that luxury. And he said that you really didn't talk, when they came back from the Vietnam War, they really didn't talk about the New Zealand soldiers that died beside them, that died in the war. They missed them, they thought about them, but at that time it was considered bad taboo to talk about them, so they went for about 20 or 30 years without talking about any of the New Zealand soldiers that they lost during the Vietnam War. It was just something at that time that people didn't talk about. And New Zealand, okay, when the soldiers came back to New Zealand from the Vietnam War, particularly the 161 artillery battery, they were thrown tomatoes at them. They were not treated well. They were spit on, thrown tomatoes at. They had tomatoes thrown at them. And the protesters threw tomatoes at the soldiers, which was pretty disgusting and despicable. America had that problem as well. So did Australia, not welcoming the Vietnam veterans back as well as they should have. Daphne Shaw, when she came back from the Vietnam War, and some of the nurses that she served with, some of the protesters called them pieces of crap, things like that. And Daphne Shaw and her friends just gave it back to them, just started cussing them out. The way they thought was it was their right to protest, but it's our right to say what we want to say too. That's the way she thought, and she thought New Zealand's a democratic country, that the protesters need to have that right to protest. That's what she personally thought. But she said that people from the 161 artillery battery were really hurt and really devastated at the treatment that they got when they got home. However, all countries make mistakes, and New Zealand in 2008 issued an apology to the Vietnam War veterans. They issued an apology in 2008, and also they had the proper welcome home party. They called all the veterans back to do a welcome home party, and then they had the proper parade where there were no protests, nobody was throwing anything, nobody was upset with them. So they undid a bad deed, which is really admirable and really honorable and really respectable. Apologizing to the Vietnam War veterans like that, and I highly commend that, and I highly respect that. So God bless the brave New Zealand soldiers that were in the Vietnam War, and we need to know about their accomplishments, and we need to know about their achievements. They played a vital role in the Battle of Long Tan. They treated a lot of sick and injured and wounded Australian and New Zealand soldiers, as well as South Vietnamese soldiers and South Vietnamese civilians, as I pointed out. One of the Australian soldiers that Daphne Shaw treated, he had his leg blown off and had some shrapnel in his stomach as well, and they were able to save him. And she kept in touch with him about 5-10 years after the war. For about 5-10 years straight, she kept in touch with him, and they corresponded with each other. And sometimes when the soldiers were too sick or too injured to write letters home, the nurses would write letters home for them. That's how honorable those nurses were. And so they were able to know a lot about the soldiers' personal lives. And also, Bruce Knight, when he would go on patrols to catch the Viet Cong or to to scout the Viet Cong, there was one patrol where they thought that those were just artillery shells buried into the ground. Old artillery shells buried into the ground. Well, unbeknownst to them, and they were just shocked at this, those were landmines. And some of those soldiers walked 100 yards across the field filled with landmines. And one of the soldiers had both his legs blown off. Another soldier had one leg blown off. One got shrapnel all in his stomach. It was just a horrible sight. And the NVA and the VC disguised those mines very well. And it was unfortunate. Brave New Zealand soldiers on that particular patrol, some of them lost their legs. And all New Zealand soldiers volunteered to go to the Vietnam War. Just a sad situation. It just shows you how brave and how selfless these soldiers were. And I believe, the ones that are still alive, I believe they still are. So, anyway, I hope everybody's doing well. Take care. God bless. And bye-bye. Bye-bye.